Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 27 cheat sheet as we look ahead towards sort of building our strategies in FPL. We now finally have some very concrete information in terms of the fixtures that we have in Game Week 29, and that should allow you guys to start building your wildcard strategy. If you have wildcard like me already, of course, you can just choose a direction. I still think, for example, for myself, I'll be still pursuing a free hit 34 strategy since I already have a couple free hit 29 or rather blank Game Week 29 players within my team. Just to confirm, of course, with the FA Cup outcomes, what we have now is a landscape of 4 fixtures in Game Week 29. Those 4 fixtures are as follows. West Ham versus Aston Villa, so that's going to be Villa away. Fulham versus Spurs, that's going to be Spurs away. And then Burnley versus Brentford. Of course, these were the original fixtures. However, we have been, graced with just a very meager Luton versus Nottingham Forest figure. What is interesting, though, of course, is from a team planning perspective, if you're let's say not wildcard on Game Week 27, investing into Luton players over the next 3 weeks actually does make sense, right? Because you will have confirmed fixtures on 27, 29, and you'll have a double on 28. So that's why Luton is probably the only team that I think has really moved out of this sort of equation as having been interesting for FPL players, from a sort of investment point of view. After that, I think a lot of the outcomes were sort of expected. So this was the most likely and probable scenario if you were watching my chip strategy videos. And that's that. So in terms of my own team, just quickly mentioning, of course, we're still within the top 1,000 in the world. So in a really good position. But as I said, I will be pursuing a sort of free hit 34 strategy. We'll see how things go from there. I'm not going to talk any more about it. Let's just jump quickly into the cheat sheet this week. So the cheat sheet this week has actually been updated as a result of course, the FA Cup sort of understandings. In the midfield, we still have players like Garnacho, Douglas Luiz, and Bailey. The only reason why I've kept Garnacho here is because I still think that if let's say you're thinking about, even forecasting into the future when, let's say, Man United would have doubles in Game Week 34, potentially, or for example, even Game Week 37, what we're talking about is that a team like United is actually still very interesting to own, right? You'd have Man United versus Sheffield United, which would actually happen, for example, on that Game Week 34 fixture. You'd probably have a double as a result of that too. So that becomes very interesting in terms of owning Man United assets. As far as, let's say, for example, some of the other picks like Fran or Rashford, they're less interesting, of course. So that's why I think it's worth sort of recognizing the difference in terms of holding someone like Garnacho on your bench for a while versus, of course, a more expensive pick. Whereas Douglas Luiz and Bailey, of course, they still have confirmed fixtures for Game Week 29, and generally, of course, a good fixture on Game Week 30, plus, of course, a decent fixture on Game Week 28 if you were to look at, for example, the attacking point of view, given that these are midfielders, not, for example, defenders. Tavernier has been added to the cheat sheet as well. I think it's simply the next 3 fixtures, and 2 of them, of course, being a double Game Week 28 fixture with Sheffield United at home and Luton Town at home, just is incredible. He's also been rested, for example, in the FA Cup. So I think the likelihood that he's the midfielder or the attacker that's non-Solanke, for example, who actually gets the most amount of play time and actually is the most interesting just because he's on some set pieces is there. So I think Tavernier is interesting. Of course, he does blank in Game Week 29, so do keep that in mind. With Neto, he gets a drop. However, we did see that he actually played centre forward when Hwang sort of had his hamstring injury. It seems to be a very light injury, which Gary O'Neill confirmed. However, Hwang also drops later, as you can see in this sort of section of the cheat sheet, because Gary O'Neill has sort of ruled him out for the weekend. Now, of course, there might be some sort of miraculous development. First of all, of course, Wolves are a little bit short-staffed in terms of the teams and the players, for example, with Cunha's injury. So it might be the case that they try to rush Hwang back, which I think is still unlikely. But, of course, Neto playing centre forward, that could be a slight boost to his estimations as a player for the next 2 weeks. However, of course, he still blanks for Game Week 29. As far as Barkley, he gets a rise, for the same reason why we were talking about these Luton players being interesting, right? Barkley now actually is a very valid pick, because if you were to, let's say, compare him to Tavernier, I think the difference is that he has worse fixtures, but still has overall the ability to cover you on Game Week 29. So I think Barkley actually is quite interesting. Another thing that I'll mention too about Barkley is that he is probably one of the worst assets here in terms of the expected goal involvement for 23-24. However, you're still looking at a pick who actually is on set pieces. So I think sometimes that's not always reflective of how good a certain pick would be in terms of underlying stats, because with set pieces, usually you're creating very small XG chances, and that usually doesn't convert very well. For example, a lot of the defenders who frequently score aerial goals, like a Gabriel or Virgil van Dijk, have very low XG per 90, but of course, they're still threats, just like, for example, the person delivering those threats would, for example, benefit quite a lot in terms of expected assists per 90, but not as much as you'd think, for example, compared to some of the more creative players in open play. With Palmer, of course, I still think he deserves a rise. Now that, for example, you've removed one blank fixture out of the equation, and of course the Man City away fixture from the equation, the simple reality is that Palmer sort of comes back to reassuming his position as basically the best asset in the game from a sort of price value perspective. So I think basically as soon as we hit game week 30, for example, when that Burnley at home fixture rears its head around, we'll have Palmer basically as the de facto king of FPL, in my opinion, right now from an efficiency point of view. As far as Ward-Prowse, no changes there. The next tier, of course, are the 6.x players. It is a weird one here, of course, because these two players actually have two decent fixtures, but Game Week 29 is a blank. So I think with Gordon and Gross, it really just depends on your strategy. For example, if I was owning Gross or Gordon, what I would probably do is actually continue to own these players. There's nothing wrong with them. I have dropped them recently just because, of course, the expectations of the blank, and these blanks have been confirmed. However, another thing to mention is that if you, let's say, are not pursuing a free at 29 strategy, one thing that we should recognize is that you don't need to have 12 players. So I would not be recommending people to take a hit for, triple Aston Villa, triple West Ham, triple Spurs, for example, and Brentford players. It's not necessary to do so. I think it's perfectly fine if you can reasonably get there. Let's say, for example, you're planning a wildcard 27 and you're going for a free hit 34 direction. You might still have 10 players, at best for Game Week 29. And that's still okay because you're sort of planning for the future as well. And that this is part of the FPL landscape. You don't want to for example, indulge in a specific game week when you're planning ahead with a wild card. So that's one thing I'd mention. I think Gordon Gross are very, very, very good valid keeps. And of course, with Gordon too, recently we saw that he was on penalties. If, for example, there's another injury to Isaac, I mean, he's in the money again. With Gross, if João Pedro still being out, you still have access to the penalty taker for Brighton. So that's nice. As far as the next tier, we have some significant movements. This is simply because now that, of course, there are less fixtures confirmed for Game Week 29 that we technically expected, because, of course, there was chances of more upsets that could create additional fixtures. Because that's not happened, I think players like Richarlison, players like Bowen, of course, get another boost once again this week. I gave Bowen a rise last week. I gave Richarlison a drop recently, of course, just due to the blank. But of course, now you're just looking at sort of a window where, unfortunately, of course, with the blank and then subsequently really good Tottenham fixtures, Richarlison sort of has a yo-yo effect in the game. This happens from time to time. Last season, we had the same thing exactly with Brighton and Brentford assets. You have a similar situation here with Spurs assets where, of course, after a blank, they're suddenly extremely valuable picks because their fixtures are quite good. And they're still a very good attacking team where we would like to pick some of their attacking players. So I think Richarlison is very good for that reason. Moving on to the next tier, same case here with Maddison. No changes really with Odegaard, Foden, and Fernandes. I would like to say, of course, the issue, I suppose, with someone like Foden, of course, is it always comes down to whatever strategy choice you have. So a lot of people who, for example, will be free hitting on 29 should not be viewing Foden necessarily as a yellow pick. In my opinion, he would obviously be a green pick. Whereas, for example, let's say if you were to pursue a free hit 34 strategy, it would be very valid to see Foden potentially even as worse than a yellow tier asset. So I think I've tried to be fair because you need to sort of evaluate some of these players depending on the chip strategy you have. So for example, what I would do, of course, is look at the prospective Game Week 29 fixture and the prospective 34 fixture, and in general, what kind of team you want to have by 3 at 34 or 3 at 29, and how that changes your individual game week planning before you can actually evaluate the picks as well. What I'm trying to do is be a little bit more objective. So not even thinking about necessarily whether you have a free hit in play or not. So that's one thing to mention. And of course, in the premium tier, no changes. With De Bruyne, of course, he seems to have overcome his injury. With Salah, unfortunately, we did not see him as part of the FA Cup fixture. So I think the likelihood that he's going to play significant minutes versus Nottingham Forest is very, very rare, which is why I've given, of course, Salah an asterisk. So for me, I would not be investing into Salah in Game Week 27. If I was wildcarding, I kind of like the idea of keeping Salah just as a punt, but you're taking a lot of risk as well. But you will also get information from Jurgen Klopp in the press conferences leading up to Game Week 27. So your wildcard strategy, let's say if you're pursuing someone like Salah, should be informed by that anyways. And I don't think that it's necessarily detrimental to go for Salah because, of course, he will be doubling after, for example, Game Week 29 at a certain point in time. So, for example, Game Week 34. As far as, let's say, moving on towards the forwards in the cheat sheet here, what we have is just, once again, just the reflection that Luton is the sort of team of choice, and that there's actually a very restrictive landscape here, of course, particularly due to, for example, the Højlund injuries, the blanks that we have involved in Game Week 29, and also the simple fact that a lot of the forwards right now are going to be permanently good for quite a while. So, for example, Tony, I can see being a very good pick for the rest of the season. Watkins, I can see being an amazing pick until that sort of Game Week 31/33 window where you might be reconsidering whether Watkins should belong in your team. Because, of course, we've been talking about Watkins in his run of games. It's still incredible in terms of the level of opponents that he's facing. But eventually, of course, those fixtures get worse if you look at Aston Villa's fixture run to close out the season. So, of course, someone like Watkins, he's not going to be one of the best assets in the game after that fixture run is over. So right now, though, he still is one of the best picks. And with Haaland, of course, even, for example, the captaincy versus GameWeek 27 with United, I just really can't surpass that. I think he's still, for example, for me, the top captaincy option, despite the fact that Saka, for example, has a Sheffield United away fixture. So, I would not be, for example, recommending suddenly people to move out of Haaland if they were wildcarding on 27, for example. With Solanke, it's an interesting one because what Andoni Iraola said was that he has a knee problem, but he also mentioned that he has a scan. So I think we don't necessarily have to just mention that it's just purely a cup injury. It might be the case that, let's say, Solanke just needs one game week of rest potentially versus Burnley, and who knows what the sort of course of play would be. Because another issue too is that Enes Unal is also injured. I think he has some sort of shoulder injury, and he's also getting checked. So the lack of Bournemouth forwards might, for example, mean that it's important that Solanke comes back in and plays in such a crucial game versus Burnley here, just for example, for Bournemouth to continue their ascendancy in the league table. However, of course, the best thing to do would just be to wait for press conferences. Hope that we get an update on Solanke, and I think, of course, he becomes the prime transfer option for a lot of managers this week, particularly if you don't own him already. As far as Jesus and players like Darwin, unfortunately, still has an asterisk around him, because, of course, of the uncertainty. He was not involved within the FA Cup squad once again. And then, as I said, with Morris and Adebayo, going back to these Luton players, Adebayo, of course, still has, for example, the asterisk attached to him because he was not involved within the FA Cup squad that was competing versus Man City, but he could very well come back and he could be quite interesting. Whereas Morris, of course, I think is now the safer pick between the two of them because you're just looking at a player who should play most of the games, right, over the next 3 weeks, and also he's the penalty taker. So I do quite like Morris quite a lot over this window, and I think he's probably one of the picks to go for, and one of the better picks as well that would probably allow you to, if let's say you're a manager who recently moved into an 8-attacker structure, and you want to actually move into a 7-attacker structure, then Morris is your man. But of course, that also suggests that you're looking for an opportunity to go into Morris, and potentially you might have to wait just until Game Week 28 instead before you actually make that move. And of course, we'll get an update on Adebayo hopefully by then too. So I wouldn't, for example, be jumping the gun in terms of transferring a Luton forward at this window. Right now, of course, for me, the fixture of Tony Chelsea at home is still a very good fixture. Chelsea's defense, particularly away from home, has been poor. Of course, they did put a good performance reasonably in the first half versus City, but you just have to be sort of respective of Chelsea's overall effort in the season. It's not like they've been an incredible team, and some recent performances have also confirmed that within the cup matches. As far as, for example, Watkins and Haaland, no changes there as well. With Alvarez, I think the concern once again is that with De Bruyne coming back, that's potentially still less minutes because we've seen some more Alvarez benchings, right? This was a player who basically played 25 games in a row and was benched in the previous fixture. So we're already starting to see the reduction in Alvarez minutes, which I think is just fair to keep him at that sort of orange tier right now in FPL. With the defense, we have, once again, a few changes, and a lot of this is, once again, reflective of whether you're going to pursue a certain strategy. If you don't, for example, have a free hit in hand, I think this will be a very objective list for you. Zabarnyi, for me, is the most interesting defender right now. I've kept Senesi at a yellow tier, and that's because Senesi's on 8 yellow cards. Another thing between Zabarnyi and Senesi, of course, is that you would argue that Senesi is probably the better set-piece threat. Zabarnyi is ironically 5 cm taller, I believe, than Senesi, but when you look at the expected goals per 90, it doesn't really seem like Zabarnyi is going to be a consistent set-piece threat. However, I will also add that Senesi has been rotated quite early on in the recent 2 matches for Bournemouth, and these were in games where Bournemouth wanted to chase and wanted to score goals. So what Bournemouth have been doing is subbing Senesi off, bringing an attacker in, such as a midfielder, and then simply dropping Lewis Cook into a central defensive position, allowing him to play out of the back effectively as a right center back. So that is quite interesting in terms of the minutes of Senesi, and I think I can't rate Senesi as a green tier pick for that reason. For me, Zabarnyi just gives you the safety. Although you might also argue that you might prefer someone like Senesi, because if, let's say, he's carrying a clean sheet at, let's say, I don't know, 70 minutes, and he gets subbed off, then technically you would have bagged a clean sheet before, for example, Bournemouth had the chance to lose it. But, it really depends on what your preference is. Minutes or someone who potentially could even lose this spot on the team with Senesi, which I think is a little bit of a doubt right now. But of course, he's on 8 yellow cards, and I think there's enough doubt to say I'd just go with Zabarnyi for now. With Doughty, as I said, simply because that Nottingham Forest at home fixture has been confirmed. As you can see, the next 4 fixtures for Luton are actually very good. Now, of course, their defense continues to be a absolutely horrific defense, but it's no secret that Doughty is still a very good attacking player, and he's actually one of those few FPL picks where when you look at the expected goal involvement per 90, I mean, there's not many players, for example, in the game that really compare to that within a reasonable sample size, right? For example, if you look at a player like Bradley, of course, his underlying stats are incredible. If you look at Reguilon as well, but these are also players who've not necessarily played enough minutes this season for us to say that their numbers are averaged out enough, or that sort of small sample size effect has sort of come and gone. So I think it's very fair to say that Doughty's definitely one of the leading players in the league at that sort of price point as well. With Udogie, I think he's an interesting pick. He's back at full training, whereas Porro, for example, is still out of training. We might get an update on Porro, of course, closer towards the Gaming 27 deadline, but right now I'm working off the assumption that Porro is not going to be available for Gaming 27. Now, of course, if Porro magically comes back before Gaming 27, I think he's going to still be my defender pick of choice if I was to go for a Spurs player. Whereas with Udogie, him coming back from training, or coming back into training and actually being available for Gaming 27 completely changes the dynamic of, let's say, if you wanted to carry one Spurs defender on Gaming 27, who you would go for over this run and to try target a Spurs defender in Gaming 29, right? Which is the crucial fixture where everyone has a blank. So for me, Udogie right now is clear of Porro. With Van Heck, I think he just gets a fall simply because, of course, Gaming 29. I don't think it's necessarily fair that someone who has, let's say, only 2 fixtures out of 3 in the next 3 game weeks, can't even be considered a green tier pick. As you can see, the competing picks are players like, Udogie with 3, Zabarni, who at least has 3, Doughty, for example, who has 4. So you're looking at appearance points. You're looking at, of course, these aren't necessarily the best defenses, right? We're not saying that Bournemouth is an elite defense. We're not saying Spurs or Luton certainly are elite defenses, but these players still at least have the sort of drawback, or at least the upside of the attacking value there to sort of replicate points in FPL. As far as, let's say, some of the other picks, Reguilon, I still think that the immediate fixtures are so poor for Reguilon, it's very hard to rate him as a yellow pick. We've also seen that performance versus West Ham. I wouldn't say that one game performance versus West Ham has completely changed my opinion on Brentford as a team. But the reality too is that if you look at, for example, their league rankings in terms of expected goals conceded, that this Brentford team have actually considerably dropped off quite a bit. And that's abnormal, right? Because the last 2 seasons we saw Brentford as quite a comfortably top half defensive team. With, for example, the Mee injury as well, I think that makes the team a lot worse. We know that the Raya change to Flecken, for example, has made the team worse, and those kind of things have a correlative impact on, for example, Reguilon and his validity as a pick. With Ait Nouri, of course, it's just a 2 out of 3 game week fixture impact as well. And with Pau, we have to see exactly what the results of his scan is. Right now, we know that Konsa is coming back to training soon, but of course, I don't know if Konsa is going to be necessarily fit and ready and available for Gaming 27. However, it seems like he might make it for Gaming 29. However, that's a bad fixture technically on paper for Aston Villa anyways, if you were to think that this West Ham team look a little bit better now with Paqueta. And one thing to mention with, let's say, for example, swapping between Konsa, Pau, or even, for example, considering Moreno is, as you can see, Moreno has dropped too, is that the overall issue is that we're now starting to see a lot more Luka Dean minutes. The last match for Moreno is exactly what you never want to see when you own a player defensively in FPL, right? Someone who doesn't reach 60 minutes within a game. And I'm not saying that Moreno's starting position in the team has been lost, but we're starting to see that the position in the team is shaky and the minutes are shaky as well. So Moreno has to drop. With Pau, of course, the injury situation is the only thing that precludes him really from being a green pick, because I think he's one of the only Aston Villa defenders that we can actually say are nailed, with exception to Konsa if he was able to come back to the team fully fit. With Bradley, he's an interesting one because I think we've seen him play some very interesting positions for this Liverpool team. But of course, the question is going to be how many players are coming back for Liverpool over the next few weeks, and how soon are they coming back? The next fixture is actually a decent fixture in the sense that it's Nottingham Forest away from home. And this Nottingham Forest team, they're not, for example, an absolute world beater in terms of attack. However, of course, when you just look at the fixtures in the distance, you have a Game Week 29 blank, you have a Game Week 28 fixture versus Man City. If you didn't already go for Bradley, there's absolutely no reason why you'd be considering him. And the same goes, for example, someone like Botman too, with this Newcastle team that actually looked like an absolutely horrific defense. As far as, for example, the Arsenal defenders, one of the reasons why you'll still see them as a green tier pick, despite, for example, my reflection of their ranking here and the amount of fixtures that they have, is the simple reality that this Arsenal defense is the best defense in the league. And I would actually go as far as to say by far. That's how good this Arsenal team have been this season. They're leading the league in clean sheets. They're leading the league in terms of expected goals conceded. So even from an analytics point of view, a results point of view, we can clearly say that they're one of the best defenses. I guess there's a timber concern with Gabriel, but I think one thing to mention, of course, is that for me, there still is an asterisk of whatever was going on, internally between Gabriel, Arsenal, and Arteta at the start of the season, and that changing his position within the team. I'm not overall concerned about Gabriel, White, and Saliba for now. We also need to monitor the Zinchenko injury because, of course, if Zinchenko's out for a while and longer than we think, and unfortunately Arteta does not give us sufficient information to be able to sort of conclude on that, Kiwior, of course, becomes an amazing pick because he's at a ridiculous price point. But the biggest thing and the overarching point here with Arsenal defense is that there is absolutely no reason to drop them. And that's the sort of reality, I think, for FPL right now. As far as, let's say, Ake, Walker, and Porro, these sorts of players, as I said, Porro would be a green pick if he was not injured or if he was back in training. As far as Ake and Walker, I think the concern right now is that we are fully in the stage of the season where we have Champions League for Man City, and we have to consider the serious and the severity, of course, of rotation. For example, with Guardiola coming back in a few weeks, we know that that means less Ake minutes. With, for example, Walker, we already know that Stones coming back has taken away some of his minutes when he's able to be rested. Ruben Diaz might actually be the one who I actually like the most out of them, but we also have seen previously in the season that someone like Akanji can technically deputize over Ruben Diaz. And of course, if Stones is already back in the team, that can happen, right? You could see, for example, a backline of something like Ake, Akanji, and Stones, or some backline that actually fits Guardiola in. So that's my concern really with Man City defenders. I would like to say that even Diaz is here as a yellow pick, but these are the only three players I'd consider. The simple reality, I think, is that Ederson is actually still the best pick as a goalkeeper going forwards, because if you're planning for, let's say, a GameWeek 37 bench boost, we are expecting a Man City double in that fixture there. So that's what makes Ederson very interesting. As far as the sort of premium tier of defenders, I have to say Virgil's the most interesting. The simple reality, of course, is I don't think you have to mess around with, for example, potential Robertson rotation. Who knows at what stage, for example, Robertson is within the squad, right? Tsimikas has played well. He's deputized decently, for example, in the season. And of course, even though Robertson has actually basically stolen away all Tsimikas' potential available minutes where possible, it might be the case that Tsimikas has turned the corner, but I think it's very hard for me to conclude on something like that because Robertson has historically taken so much minutes. The only thing I can say, though, on the flip side is that Virgil van Dijk is someone who's always guaranteed minutes within this Liverpool team, and the aerial threat is very clear. So when you compare, for example, Virgil van Dijk to some of the other leading set piece threats in the league, only Gabriel and Dunk, these are the sorts of players that really compete, as top, for example, aerial threats within the league that also are reflected within the underlying stats in terms of expected goals involvement per 90. So nice to see Virgil there, but keep in mind, of course, our valuation of Liverpool's defense has also improved over the course of the season. So even though Virgil still looks like someone at an outrageous price, and maybe Gabriel looks like a steal, I think in the context that, for example, Virgil's still a very good pick and could double in the future, I still think Virgil's very, very good and worth keeping. It's not fair, for example, to judge people by the price of Arsenal defenders, is all I'm trying to say. And with Trippier, unfortunately, he falls. The GameWeek 29 fixture being confirmed, and also, for example, the just general form of the team, not necessarily just form in terms of how many goals have they conceded, but just generally within the underlying stats, how poor they've been, within the rolling 8 to 10 games that we've seen over the last 2 to 3 months. It is horrific, and there are no signs of that changing, really. So that's the concern with Newcastle. Rounding off quickly within the goalkeepers, we just have some confirmations, with Areola and Kaminsky getting confirmed fixtures for GameWeek 29. Obviously, Areola always had a fixture confirmed for GameWeek 29, but I think the difference now is that because there are less upsets, you also have to think about, what are the best keepers, for example, if also wildcard in 27. What Areola does provide for wildcarders is, for example, access to the cheapest keeper in the game who also has a fixture on GameWeek 29. With someone like, for example, Kaminsky, you're looking at someone who could double, of course, on GameWeek 28, which is very, very interesting, because not only would you have a player who actually plays on GameWeek 28, you also have someone who is confirmed to play on GameWeek 29 on a relatively good fixture. Whereas, for example, with Neto, the concern is that if you're going for Neto, he might, of course, double very shortly after that, but you're also looking at a player who blanks from GameWeek 29. So actually picking Neto on a wildcard right now, I might actually prefer, for example, a pair up of something like Kaminsky plus Ederson over, for example, Neto plus another keeper. And that's something to think about, because, for example, you might not like Areola, you might not like Flecken, you might, for example, prefer something like Raya Kaminsky instead as well. And that could be a very valid pair. As far as the other keepers, we have added Kelleher, and that's simply because we think Allison will come back around game week 30, but he's a differential, and there's absolutely no reason to sort of even consider Kelleher, in my opinion, unless there's some sort of weird wildcard draft where you suddenly magically squeeze someone at the price point of Kelleher within your team. I think there's no reason really to consider Kelleher right now. So this is really the full understanding the picture of the goalkeepers for now. Ederson might even be considered a green pick, but also, as I said, you're looking at someone who doubles very late in terms of the fixture schedule. So whilst Ederson has some tough fixtures like Liverpool away, the blank game week 29, the distance, I think it's worth, for example, recognizing Ederson as a good pair with another goalkeeper, for example, as I said, Kaminsky. So those are my thoughts in terms of the game week 27 cheat sheet. As I said, a lot of the development in our understanding comes from the FA Cup fixtures and the results there and the impacts there, and you need to take some time before you even make your transfers for game week 27 to sort of think about, what transfers can you make right now to lead yourself towards a certain strategy and try to maximize the points potential of that strategy. So if you've decided on a free hit, it's time to start ignoring players who play on game week 29 or game week 34 and things like that. So that's all I have to say for this week. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.